The Great Queen, 1558 to 1603. 1. The Uses of Adversity. On November 17, 1558, a courier galloped into the court of the royal palace at Hatfield, 36 miles north of London, and announced to Elizabeth Tudor that she was Queen of England. Her half-sister Queen Mary, of pitiful fame, had died in the dark of that morning. In London, the Parliament, receiving the news, cried out, "God save Queen Elizabeth! Long may she reign over us!" not dreaming that it would be 45 years. The churches, though foreboding trouble, thrilled the air with the clangor of their bells. The people of England, as they had done for Mary, spread festive tables in the streets, and that evening they colored the sky with bonfires of eternal hope. By Saturday the 19th, the leading lords, ladies, and commoners of the realm had gathered at Hatfield to vow their allegiance and feather their nests. To them, on the 20th, Elizabeth spoke right royally. "My lords, the laws of nature move me to sorrow for my sister. The burden that has fallen upon me maketh me amazed. And yet, considering I am God's creature ordained to obey his appointment, I will thereto yield, desiring from the bottom of my heart that I may have assistance of his grace to be the minister of his heavenly will in the office now committed to me. And as I am but one body materially considered, though by his permission a body politic to govern, so shall I desire you all, my lords, chiefly you of the nobility, every one in his degree and power, to be assistant to me, that I with my ruling and you with your service may make a good account to Almighty God, and leave some comfort to our posterity on earth." On the 28th, clad in purple velvet, Elizabeth rode through London in public procession to that same tower where, 4 years earlier, she had been a prisoner awaiting death. Now, on her route, the populace acclaimed her, choruses chanted her glory, children tremblingly recited to her the little speeches of homage they had memorized, and such shooting of guns as never was heard afore heralded a reign destined to abound beyond any English precedent in splendor of men and minds. 25 years of trials had tempered Elizabeth to mastery. It seemed, in 1533, good fortune to have been fathered by Henry VIII, but it was dangerous to have been born of Anne Boleyn. The disgrace and execution of the mother fell within the child's forgetful years, 1536. Yet the pain of that sombre heritage outlived her youth and yielded only to the balm of sovereignty. An Act of Parliament, 1536, declared Anne's marriage null, making Elizabeth illegitimate. Coarse gossip debated the girl's paternity. In any case, to most Englishmen she was the daughter of adultery. Her legitimacy was never re-established in law, but another Act of Parliament, 1544, confirmed her right after her half-brother Edward and her half-sister Mary to succeed to the throne. During Edward's rule, 1547 to 53, she adhered to the Protestant worship, but when Catholic Mary acceded, Elizabeth, preferring life to consistency, conformed to the Roman ritual. After Wyatt's rebellion, 1554, had failed to unseat Mary, Elizabeth was accused of complicity and was sent to the Tower. But Mary judged her guilt unproved and released her to live under surveillance at Woodstock. Before Mary died, she recognized her sister as her successor and sent her the jewels of the crown. We owe Elizabeth's reign to the kindliness of the bloody queen. Elizabeth's more formal education was overwhelming. Her famous tutor, Roger Ascham, boasted that she talks French and Italian as well as she does English, and has often talked to me readily and well in Latin, moderately in Greek. She had a daily stint of theology and became expert in Protestant dogma, but her Italian teachers seemed to have transmitted to her something of the skepticism they had imbibed from Pomponazzi, Machiavelli, and Renaissance Rome. She was never sure of her crown. Parliament, 1553, had reaffirmed the invalidity of her mother's marriage to her father. State and Church agreed that she was a bastard, and English law, ignoring William the Conqueror, excluded bastards from the throne. The whole Catholic world, and England was still largely Catholic, believed that the legal heir to the English sceptre was Mary Stuart, great-granddaughter of Henry VII. It was intimated to Elizabeth that if she made her peace with the Church, the Pope would wash her free of bastardy and recognize her right to rule. She was not so inclined. Thousands of Englishmen held property that had been expropriated from the Church by Parliament under Henry VIII and Edward VI. These influential possessors, fearing that a continued Catholic restoration might enforce restitution, were prepared to fight for a Protestant queen, and the Catholics of England preferred her to civil war. On January 15, 1559, amid the acclamation of Protestant London, Elizabeth was crowned in Westminster Abbey as Queen of England, France, and Ireland, Defender of the Faith. For English monarchs since Edward III had regularly claimed the throne of France. Nothing had been left undone to provide the Queen with problems. She was now 25, in all the charm of maturing womanhood. She was moderately tall, with a good figure, fair features, olive complexion, flashing eyes, auburn hair, and beautiful hands which she knew how to display. It seemed impossible that such a lass should cope successfully with the chaos that encompassed her. Hostile creeds divided the land, playing for power and wielding arms. Pauperism was endemic, and vagrancy had survived the terrible penalties laid upon it by Henry VIII. Domestic trade was clogged by a dishonest currency. Half a century of false coinage had left the credit of the fisc so low that the government had to pay 14% for loans. Mary Tudor, absorbed in religion, had skimped on national defense. The fortresses were neglected, the coasts unprotected, the navy unfit, the army ill-paid and ill-fed, and its cadres unfilled. England, which under Wolsey had held the balance of power in Europe, was now a political cripple bandied about between Spain and France. French troops were in Scotland, and Ireland was inviting Spain. The Pope was holding over the Queen's head the threat of excommunication and interdict, and of invasion by the Catholic states. Invasion definitely loomed in 1559, and fear of assassination was part of Elizabeth's life from day to day. She was saved by the disunion of her enemies, the wisdom of her counselors, and the courage of her soul. The Spanish ambassador was shocked by the spirit of the woman. She is possessed of the devil who is dragging her to his place. Europe had not expected to find the spirit of an emperor behind the smiles of a girl. 2. Elizabethan government. Her penetration proved itself at once in her choice of aides. Like her embattled father, and despite her political speech at Hatfield, she chose men of untitled birth, for most of the older nobles were Catholic, and some thought themselves fitter than she to wear the crown. As her secretary and principal adviser, she named William Cecil, whose genius for prudent policy and assiduous detail became so outstanding a factor in her success that those who did not know her thought him king. His grandfather was a prosperous yeoman become country gentleman. His father was yeoman of the wardrobe to Henry VIII. His mother's dowry raised the family to a comfortable estate. William left Cambridge without a degree, took law at Gray's Inn, sowed his wild oats in London's common fields, entered the House of Commons at 23, 1543, and married, as his second wife, Mildred Cooke, whose grim Puritanism helped him toe the Protestant line. He served Protector Somerset, then Somerset's enemy Northumberland. He supported Lady Jane Grey to succeed Edward VI, but switched to Mary Tudor in the nick of time. He became a conforming Catholic at her suggestion, and was appointed by her to welcome Cardinal Pole into England. He was a man of affairs who did not allow his theological somersaults to disturb his political equilibrium. When Elizabeth made him her secretary, she addressed him with her usual sagacity. "I give you this charge, that you shall be of my privy council, and content to take pains for me and my realm. This judgment I have of you, that you will not be corrupted by any manner of gift, and that you will be faithful to the state, and that without respect of my private will you will give me that counsel which you think best, and if you shall know anything necessary to be declared to me of secrecy, you shall show it to myself only, and assure yourself I will not fail to keep taciturnity therein, and therefore herewith I charge you. The test of his fidelity and competence is that she kept him as secretary for 14 years, then as Lord Treasurer for 26 more, till his death. He presided over the council, managed foreign relations, directed public finance and national defense, and guided Elizabeth in the definitive establishment of Protestantism in England. Like Richelieu, he thought the safety and stability of his country required the unifying absolutism of the monarch as against the divisive ambitions of contentious nobles, covetous merchants, and fratricidal faiths. He had some Machiavellian ways, rarely cruel but relentless against opposition. Once he thought of having the Earl of Westmoreland assassinated. But that was an impatient moment in a half-century of patient tenacity and personal rectitude. He had eyes and spies for everything, but eternal vigilance is the price of power. He was acquisitive and thrifty, but Elizabeth pardoned his wealth for his wisdom, and loved the parsimony that accumulated the means for defeating the Armada. Without him she might have been misled by such lighter lights and spendthrift peacocks as Leicester, Hatton, and Essex. Cecil, reported the Spanish ambassador, has more genius than the rest of the council put together, and is therefore envied and hated on all sides. Elizabeth sometimes listened to his enemies, and now and then treated him so harshly that he left her presence broken and in tears. But she knew, when out of her tantrums, that he was the steadiest pillar of her reign. In 1571 she made him Lord Burleigh, head of the new aristocracy that, in the face of hostile nobles, upheld her throne and made her kingdom great. Her minor aids deserve a line even in hurried history, for they served her with competence, courage, and scant remuneration to the exhaustion of their lives. Sir Nicholas Bacon, father of Francis, was Lord Keeper of the Great Seal from the outset of the reign till his death, 1579. Sir Francis Knowles was Privy Councillor from 1558 and Treasurer of the Royal Household till his end, 1596. Sir Nicholas Throckmorton was her skilful ambassador in France, and Thomas Randolph in Scotland, Russia, and Germany. Only next to Cecil in devotion and craft was Sir Francis Walsingham, the Secretary of State from 1573 to his death, 1590, a man of sensitive refinement, whom Spencer called the great Maecenas of his age, so shocked by repeated plots against the Queen's life that he formed for her protection a web of espionage that stretched from Edinburgh to Constantinople and caught in its skein the tragic Queen of Scots. Seldom has a ruler had servitors so able, so loyal, and so poorly paid. For the English government itself was poor. Private fortunes outshone public funds. The revenue in 1600 totaled £500,000, which even now would be a paltry $25 million. Elizabeth seldom levied direct taxes, and she took in only £36,000 in customs dues. Ordinarily, she relied on income from Crown lands, on grants in aid from the English Church, and on loans from the rich, which were practically compulsory but punctually repaid. She honored the debts left by her father, her brother, and her sister, and acquired such a reputation for solvency that she could borrow money at Antwerp at 5%, while Philip II of Spain at times could not borrow at all. She was extravagant, however, in her expenditure for dresses and finery, and in gifts of economic privileges to her favorites. Rarely and reluctantly she summoned Parliament to her financial aid, for she did not patiently bear opposition, criticism, or surveillance. She put no stock in theories of popular or parliamentary sovereignty. She believed, with Homer and Shakespeare, that only one head should rule, and why not hers, in which ran the blood and burned the pride of Henry VIII? She held to the divine right of kings and queens. She imprisoned persons at her own sharp will, without trial or stated cause, and her Privy Council, acting as the Court of Star Chamber to try political offenders, suspended without appeal the rights of habeas corpus and jury trial. She punished MPs who obstructed her purposes. She suggested to the local magnates who manipulated elections to Parliament that it would facilitate matters if they chose candidates with no boyish notions about free speech. She wanted pounds without palaver. Her early parliaments yielded gracefully. Her middle parliaments yielded angrily. Her later parliaments neared revolt. She got her will because the nation preferred her judicious absolutism to the fury of factions competing for power. No one thought of letting the people rule. Politics was, as always, a contest of minorities to determine which should rule the majority. Half of England resented Elizabeth's religious policy. Nearly all England resented her celibacy. But by and large the people, grateful for low taxes, flourishing trade, domestic order, and prolonged peace, returned the affection offered them by the Queen. She gave them pageants and progresses, listened to them without visible boredom, shared in their public games, and in 100 other ways fished for men's souls. The Spanish ambassador, while bemoaning her Protestantism, wrote to Philip, "She is much attached to the people, and is confident that they are all on her side, which is indeed true." The attempts that were made on her life strengthened her popularity and power. Even the Puritans whom she persecuted prayed for her safety, and the anniversary of her accession became a day of national thanksgiving and festival. Was she the actual ruler, or only a popular front for the lower nobility of England and the mercantile oligarchy of London? Her aides, though fearing her temper, often corrected her mistakes of policy, but she often corrected theirs. They told her disagreeable truths, gave her their contradictory counsels, and obeyed her decisions. They governed, but she ruled. "She gives her orders," reported the Spanish ambassador, "and has her way as absolutely as her father." Cecil himself seldom knew how she would decide, and he fretted over her frequent rejection of his laborious and meticulous advice. When he urged her not to treat with France, but to rely solely on Protestant support, she pulled him up with some asperity. "Mr. Secretary, I mean to have done with this business. I shall listen to the proposals of the French king. I am not going to be tied any longer to you and your brethren in Christ." Her statesmanship drove both friends and enemies to tears. She was maddeningly slow and irresolute in determining policy, but in many cases her indecision paid. She knew how to ally herself with time, which dissolves more problems than men solve. Her procrastination allowed the complex factors in a situation to settle themselves into focus and clarity. She admired the fabled philosopher who, when importuned for an answer, silently recited the alphabet before replying. She took as her motto, "Video et taceo," I see and am silent. She discovered that in politics, as in love, he who does not hesitate is lost. If her policy often fluctuated, so did the facts and forces to be weighed. Surrounded by perils and intrigues, she felt her way with forgivable caution, trying now one course, now another, and making no claim to consistency in so fluid a world. Her vacillations stumbled into some serious errors, but it kept England at peace until it was strong enough for war. Inheriting a nation politically in chaos and militarily in decay, her only practicable policy was to keep England's enemies from uniting against it, to encourage the Huguenot revolt against the French monarchy, the Netherlands revolt against Spain, the Protestant revolt against a Scottish queen too closely bound to France. It was an unscrupulous policy, but Elizabeth believed with Machiavelli that scruples are not becoming in rulers responsible for states. By whatever means her subtle weakness could devise, she preserved her country from foreign domination, maintained peace, with some brief intervals, for 30 years, and left England richer than ever before in matter and mind. As a diplomat, she could give the foreign secretaries of the age many a lesson in alert information, resourceful expedients, and incalculable moves. She was the ablest liar of her time. Of the four women, Mary Tudor, Mary Stuart, Catherine de Médicis, and Elizabeth, who illustrated Knox's monstrous regiment, rule, of women in the second half of the 16th century, Elizabeth was unquestionably supreme in political acumen and diplomatic skill. Cecil thought her the wisest woman that ever was, for she understood the interest and dispositions of all the princes in her time, and was so perfect in the knowledge of her own realm that no counselor she had could tell her anything she did not know before, which, of course, requires a grain of salt. She had the advantage of conferring directly with ambassadors in French, Italian, or Latin, and was thereby independent of interpreters and intermediaries. "This woman," said the Spanish ambassador, "is possessed with 100,000 devils. Yet she pretends to me that she would like to be a nun, live in a cell, and tell her beads from morning till night." Every continental government condemned and admired her. If she were not a heretic, said Pope Sixtus V, she would be worth the whole world. 3. The Amorous Virgin. The secret weapon of her diplomacy was her virginity. This condition, of course, is a recondite detail on which historians must not pretend to certainty. Let us be as trustful as Raleigh naming a colony. Cecil, watching Elizabeth's long flirtation with Leicester, had some passing doubts, but two Spanish ambassadors, not loath to dishonor the Queen, concluded to her honor. The gossip of the court, as reported by Ben Jonson to Drummond of Hawthornden, held that she had a membrane on her which made her incapable of man, though for her delight she tried many. A French surgeon undertook to cut it, yet fear stayed her. The people, wrote Camden in his Annales, 1615, cursed Hewick, the Queen's physician, as having dissuaded the Queen from marrying on account of some impediment and defect in her. Yet Parliament, repeatedly begging her to marry, assumed her capacity to bear. Something went wrong in this regard with most of Tudor royalty. Probably the misfortunes of Catherine of Aragon in childbirth were due to Henry VIII's syphilis. His son Edward died in youth of some ill-described disease. His daughter Mary tried fervently to have a child, only to mistake dropsy for pregnancy, and Elizabeth, though she flirted as long as she could walk, never ventured on marriage. "I have always shrunk from it," she said, and as early as 1559 she declared her intention to remain a virgin. In 1566 she promised Parliament, "I will marry as soon as I can conveniently, and I hope to have children." But in that same year, when Cecil told her that Mary Stuart had borne a son, Elizabeth almost wept, and said, "The Queen of Scots is the mother of a fair son, and I am but a barren stock." There for a moment she revealed her lasting grief, that she could not fulfill her womanhood. The political implications deepened the tragedy. Many of her Catholic subjects believed her sterility a proper punishment for her father's sins, and a promise that Catholic Mary Stuart would inherit the crown. But Parliament and the rest of Protestant England dreaded such a prospect, and importuned her to find a mate. She tried, but began by losing her heart to a married man. Lord Robert Dudley, tall, handsome, accomplished, courtly, brave, was the son of that Duke of Northumberland who had died on the scaffold for trying to disinherit Mary Tudor and make Jane Grey queen. Dudley was married to Amy Robsart, but was not living with her, and rumour called him an unprincipled philanderer. He was with Elizabeth at Windsor when his wife fell downstairs at Cumnor Hall and died of a broken neck, 1560. He and the Queen were suspected by the Spanish ambassador and others of having arranged this clumsy annulment. The suspicion was unjust, but it ended for a while Dudley's hopes of becoming consort to Elizabeth. When she thought she was dying, 1562, she begged that he might be appointed protector of the realm. She confessed that she had long loved him, but called God to witness that nothing unseemly had ever passed between them. 2 years later she offered him to the Queen of Scots and made him Earl of Leicester to enhance his charms, but Mary was loath to have her rival's lover in her bed. Elizabeth comforted him with monopolies and favoured him till his death, 1588. Cecil had borne this romance with dignified hostility. For a time he thought of resigning in protest, for his own plan contemplated a marriage that would strengthen England with the friendship of some powerful state. For a quarter of a century a succession of foreign suitors danced about the Queen. "There are 12 ambassadors of us," wrote one of them, "all competing for Her Majesty's hand. And the Duke of Holstein is coming next as a suitor for the King of Denmark. The Duke of Finland, who is here for his brother the King of Sweden, threatens to kill the Emperor's man, and the Queen fears they will cut each other's throat in her presence." She must have felt some satisfaction when Philip II, the greatest potentate in Christendom, offered her his seasoned hand, 1559. But she rejected this device for making England a Catholic dependency of Spain. She took more time in answering a proposal from Charles IX of France, for France was meanwhile kept on good behavior. The French ambassador complained that the world had been made in 6 days, and she had already spent 80 days and was still undecided. She artfully replied that the world had been made by a greater artist than herself. 2 years later she allowed English agents to propose her marriage to Charles, Archduke of Austria. But at Leicester's urging she withdrew the plan. When the international situation favored humoring France, 1570, the Duke of Alençon, son of Henri II and Catherine de Médicis, was encouraged to think of becoming the 16-year-old husband of the 37-year-old Queen. But the negotiations were wrecked on 3 obstacles: the Duke's Catholic faith, his tender youth, and his pock-marked nose. 5 years softened one of these deterrents, and Alençon, now Duke of Anjou, was considered again. He was invited to London, and for 5 years more Elizabeth played with him in France. After a final flurry, 1581, this gay courtship petered out, and Anjou retired from the field waving as a trophy a garter of the Queen. Meanwhile, she had kept him from marrying the Infanta, and thereby allying her 2 enemies, France and Spain. Rarely has a woman derived so much advantage from barrenness, or so much pleasure from virginity. 4. Elizabeth and her court. There was more satisfaction in being courted by virile Elizabethans than in being bedded by epoxy youth, and the courtship could last as long as marriage did not stifle it. Hence Elizabeth enjoyed perennial adulation and savored it insatiably. Lords ruined themselves to entertain her. Masks and pageants allegorized her glory. Poets smothered her with sonnets and dedications. Musicians strummed her praise. A madrigal celebrated her eyes as war-subduing orbs, and her breast as that fair hill where virtue dwells and sacred skill. Raleigh told her that she walked like Venus, hunted like Diana, rode like Alexander, sang like an angel, and played like Orpheus. She almost believed it. She was as vain as if all the merits of her England were the blessed fruit of her mothering, and to a degree they were. Distrustful of her physical charms, she robed herself in costly dresses, varying them almost every day. At her death, she left 2,000. She wore jewelry in her hair, on her arms and wrists and ears and gowns. When a bishop reproved her love of finery, she had him warned not to touch on that subject again, lest he reach heaven aforetime. Her manners could be alarming. She cuffed or fondled courtiers, even foreign emissaries. She tickled the back of Dudley's neck when he knelt to receive his earldom. She spat, as she list, once upon a costly coat. She was usually amiable and easy of access, but she talked volubly, and she could be an unanswerable shrew. She swore like a pirate, which, by proxy, she was. By God's death was among her milder oaths. She could be cruel, as in playing cat and mouse with Mary Stuart, or letting Lady Catherine Grey languish and die in the Tower, but she was basically kind and merciful, and she mingled tenderness with her blows. She often lost her temper, but she soon regained control of herself. She roared with laughter when amused, which was often. She loved to dance, and pirouetted till she was 69. She gamboled and gambled, and hunted and was fond of masks and plays. She kept her spirits up even when her fortunes were low, and in the face of danger she was all courage and intelligence. She was abstemious in food and drink, but covetous of money and jewelry. With relish she confiscated the property of rich rebels, and she managed to get and to hold the crown jewels of Scotland, Burgundy, and Portugal, besides a hoard of gems presented by expectant lords. She was not renowned for gratitude or liberality. Sometimes she tried to pay her servants in fair words, but there was a certain patriotism in her parsimony and her pride. When she exceeded, there was hardly a nation so poor as to do England reverence. When she died, England controlled the seas and challenged the intellectual hegemony of Italy or France. What sort of mind did she have? She had all the learning that a queen could carry gracefully. While ruling England, she continued her study of languages, corresponded in French with Mary Stuart, bandied Italian with a Venetian ambassador, and berated a Polish envoy in virile Latin. She translated Sallust and Boethius, and knew enough Greek to read Sophocles and translate a play of Euripides's. She claimed to have read as many books as any prince in Christendom, and it was likely. She studied history almost every day. She composed poetry and music, and played forgivably on the lute and the virginal. But she had sense enough to laugh at her accomplishments, and to distinguish between education and intelligence. When an ambassador complimented her on her languages, she remarked that it was no marvel to teach a woman to talk. It were far harder to teach her to hold her tongue. Her mind was as sharp as her speech, and her wit kept pace with the time. Francis Bacon reported that she was wont to say of her instructions to great officers that they were like to garments, straight at the first putting on, but did by and by wear loose enough. Her letters and speeches were composed in an English all her own, devious, involved, and affected, but rich in quaint turns, fascinating in eloquence and character. She excelled in intelligence rather than intellect. Walsingham pronounced her inapt to embrace any matter of weight, but perhaps he spoke in the bitterness of unrequited devotion. Her skill lay in feminine delicacy and subtlety of perception, not in laborious logic. And sometimes the outcome revealed more wisdom in her feline tentatives than in their reasoning. It was her indefinable spirit that counted, that baffled Europe and enthralled England, that gave spur and color to her country's flowering. She re-established the Reformation, but she represented the Renaissance, the lust to live this earthly life to the full, to enjoy and embellish it every day. She was no exemplar of virtue, but she was a paragon of vitality. Sir John Hayward, whom she sent to the Tower for giving rebellious notions to the younger Essex, forgave her enough to write of her 9 years after she could reward him. Now, if ever any person had either the gift or the style to win the hearts of people, it was this queen. If ever she did express the same, it was in coupling mildness with majesty as she did, and in stately stooping to the meanest sort. All her faculties were in motion, and every motion seemed a well-guided action. Her eyes were set upon one, her ears listened to another, her judgment ran upon a third, to a fourth she addressed her speech. Her spirit seemed to be everywhere, and yet so entire in herself as it seemed to be nowhere else. Some she pitied, some she commended, some she thanked, at others she pleasantly and wittingly jested, contemning no person, neglecting no office, and distributing her smiles, looks, and graces so artificially, artfully, that thereupon the people again redoubled the testimonies of their joys. Her court was her character, loving the things she loved and raising her flair for music, games, plays, and vivid speech to an ecstasy of poems, madrigals, dramas, and masques, and such prose as England has never known again. In her palaces at Whitehall, Windsor, Greenwich, Richmond, and Hampton Court, lords and ladies, knights and ambassadors, entertainers and servitors moved in an exciting alternation of regal ceremony and gallant gaiety. A special office of the revels prepared amusements that ranged from riddles and backgammon to complex masques and Shakespeare's plays. Ascension Day, Christmas, New Year's, Twelfth Night, Candlemas, and Shrovetide were regularly celebrated with pastimes, athletic contests, jousts, mummings, plays, and masques. The masque was one of many Italian importations into Elizabethan England, a gaudy mixture of pageantry, poetry, music, allegory, buffoonery, and ballet, put together by playwrights and artists, presented at court or on rich estates, with complex machinery and evolutions, and performed by masked ladies and gentlemen burdened with costly costumes and simple lines. Elizabeth was fond of drama, especially of comedy. Who knows how much of Shakespeare would have reached the stage, or posterity, if she and Leicester had not supported the theatre through all the attacks of the Puritans. Not content with her 5 palaces, Elizabeth sallied out almost every summer on cross-country progresses, to see and be seen, to keep an eye on her vassal lords, and to enjoy their reluctant homage. Part of the court followed her, delighted with the change and grumbling at the accommodations and the beer. Towns dressed their gentry in velvet and silk to welcome her with speeches and gifts. Nobles bankrupted themselves to entertain her. Hard-pressed lords prayed that she would not come their way. The Queen rode on horseback or in an open litter, greeting happily the crowds that gathered along the road. The people were thrilled by the sight of their invincible sovereign, and bewitched to fresh loyalty by her gracious compliments and infectious happiness. The court took on her gaiety, her freedom of manners, her luxury of dress, her love of ceremony, and her ideal of the gentleman. She liked to hear the rustle of finery, and the men around her rivaled the women in molding Oriental stuffs to Italian styles. Pleasure was the usual program, but one had to be ready at any moment for martial exploits beyond the seas. Seductions had to be circumspect, for Elizabeth felt responsible to the parents of her maids of honor for their honor. Hence she banished the Earl of Pembroke from the court for making Mary Fitton pregnant. As at any court, intrigue wove many entangling webs. The women competed unscrupulously for the men for the women, and all for the favor of the Queen and the perquisites dependent thereon. Those same gentlemen who exalted in poetry the refinements of love and morality, itched in prose for sinecures, took or gave bribes, grasped at monopolies, or shared in piratical spoils, and the avid Queen looked indulgently upon a venality that eked out the inadequate pay of her servitors. Through her grants or by her permission, Leicester became the richest lord in England. Sir Philip Sidney received vast tracts in America. Raleigh acquired 40,000 acres in Ireland. The second Earl of Essex enjoyed a corner on the importation of sweet wines, and Sir Christopher Hatton rose from the Queen's lapdog to Lord Chancellor. Elizabeth was no more sensitive to industrious brains than to handsome legs, for these pillars of society were not yet shrouded in pantaloons. Despite her faults, she set a pace and a course to elicit the reserve energies of England's worthies. She raised their courage to high enterprise, their minds to brave thinking, their manners to grace and wit and the fostering of poetry, drama, and art. Around that dazzling court and woman gathered nearly all the genius of England's greatest age. 5. Elizabeth and Religion. But within the court and through the nation, the bitter battle of the Reformation raged, and created a problem that many thought would baffle and destroy the Queen. She was a Protestant. The country was 2/3, perhaps 3/4 Catholic. Most of the magistrates, all of the clergy were Catholic. The Protestants were confined to the southern ports and industrial towns. They were predominant in London, where their number was swelled by refugees from oppression on the continent. But in the northern and western counties, almost entirely agricultural, they were a negligible few. The spirit of the Protestants, however, was immeasurably more ardent than the Catholic. In 1559, John Fox published his Rerum in Ecclesia Gestarum Commentant, describing with passion the sufferings of Protestants under the preceding reign. The volumes were translated, 1563, as Acts and Monuments, Popularly known as the Book of Martyrs, they had an arousing influence on English Protestants for over a century. Protestantism in the 16th century had the feverish energy of a new idea fighting for the future. Catholicism had the strength of traditional beliefs and ways deeply rooted in the past. In a spreading minority, the religious turmoil had generated skepticism, even, here and there, atheism. The conflict of creeds, their mutual criticism, their bloody intolerance, and the contrast between the professions and the conduct of Christians had made some matter-of-fact minds doubtful of all theologies. Hear Roger Ascham's Schoolmaster, 1563. That Italian that first invented the Italian proverb against our Englishmen Italianate meant no more their vanity in living than their lewd opinion in religion. They make more account of Tully's offices, Cicero's De Officiis, than St. Paul's epistles, of a tale in Boccaccio than a story of the Bible. Then they count as fables the holy mysteries of the Christian religion. They make Christ and his gospel only serve civil policy. Then neither religion, Protestantism or Catholicism, cometh amiss to them. In time they be promoters of both openly, in place again mockers of both privily. For where they dare, in company where they like, they boldly laugh to scorn both Protestant and Papist. They care for no scripture, they mock the Pope, they rail on Luther. The heaven they desire is only their personal pleasure and private profit, whereby they plainly declare of whose school they be, that is, Epicures in living, and atheoi in doctrine. Cecil complained, 1569, that deriders of religion, Epicureans and atheists are everywhere. John Strype declared, 1571, that many were wholly departed from the communion of the Church, and came no more to hear divine service. John Lilly, 1579, thought, there never were such sects among the heathens, such misbelief among infidels as is now among scholars. Theologians and others wrote books against atheism, which, however, could mean belief in God but disbelief in Christ's divinity. In 1579, 1583, and 1589, men were burned for denying the divinity of Christ. Several dramatists, Greene, Kidd, Marlowe, were reputed atheists. The Elizabethan drama, which otherwise so widely pictures life, contains remarkably little about the strife of faiths, but makes a great play of pagan mythology. In Shakespeare's Love's Labour's Lost, Act 4, Scene 3, line 250, are two obscure lines. O paradox! Black is the badge of hell, the hue of dungeons, and the school of night. Many have interpreted the last phrase as referring to the evening assemblies of Walter Raleigh, the astronomer Thomas Harriot, the scholar Lawrence Keymis, probably the poets Marlowe and Chapman, and some others, in Raleigh's country house at Sherborne, for the study of astronomy, geography, chemistry, philosophy, and theology. Harriot, apparently the intellectual leader of the group, had strange thoughts of the Scriptures, reported the antiquary Anthony a Wood, and always undervalued the old story of the creation. He made a philosophical theology wherein he cast off the Old Testament. He believed in God but rejected revelation and the divinity of Christ. Robert Parsons, the Jesuit, wrote in 1592 of Sir Walter Raleigh's School of Atheism, wherein both Moses and our Savior, the Old and New Testaments, are jested at, and the scholars taught to spell God backwards. Raleigh was accused of having listened to Marlowe's reading of an essay on atheism. In March 1594, a government commission sat at Cerne Abbas, Dorset, to investigate rumors of a set of atheists in the vicinity, which included Raleigh's home. The inquiry led to no action now known to us, but charges of atheism were brought against Raleigh during his trial, 1603. In the preface to his History of the World, he made it a point to enlarge upon his belief in God. Some suspicion of free-thinking clings to Elizabeth herself. "No woman," said John Richard Green, "ever lived who was so totally destitute of the sentiment of religion." Elizabeth, in Froude's judgment, was without distinct emotional conviction. Elizabeth, to whom the Protestant creed was as little true as the Catholic, had a latitudinarian contempt for theological dogmatism. She called upon God, with terrible oaths that horrified her ministers, to destroy her if she did not keep her promise to marry Alençon, while in private she jested over his pretensions to her hand. She declared to a Spanish envoy that the difference between the warring Christian creeds was a mere bagatelle, whereupon he concluded that she was an atheist. Nevertheless, she took it for granted, like almost all governments before 1789, that some religion, some supernatural source and sanction of morality, was indispensable to social order and the stability of the state. For a time, till she had consolidated her position, she appeared to hesitate, and she played upon the hopes of Catholic potentates that she might be won to their public faith. She liked the Catholic ceremony, the celibacy of the clergy, the drama of the Mass, and she might have made her peace with the Church had not this involved submission to the papacy. She distrusted Catholicism as a foreign power that might lead Englishmen to put loyalty to the Church above allegiance to the Queen. She had been reared in the Protestantism of her father, which was Catholicism minus the papacy, and this is essentially what she decided to re-establish in England. She hoped that the semi-Catholic liturgy of her Anglican Church would mollify the Catholics of the countryside, while the rejection of the papacy would satisfy the Protestants of the towns. Meanwhile, state control of education would form the new generation to this Elizabethan settlement, and the disruptive religious strife would be quieted into peace. She made her hesitations in religion, as in marriage, serve her political purposes. She kept potential enemies bemused and divided until she could face them with an accomplished fact. Many forces urged her to complete the Reformation. Continental reformers wrote to thank her in advance for restoring the new worship, and their letters touched her. Holders of formerly church property prayed for a Protestant settlement. Cecil urged Elizabeth to make herself the leader of all Protestant Europe. London Protestants indicated their sentiments by beheading a statue of St. Thomas and casting it into the street. Her first Parliament, January 23 to May 8, 1559, was overwhelmingly Protestant. The funds she asked for were voted without reservation or delay, and to raise them a tax was laid upon all persons, ecclesiastical or secular. A new Act of Uniformity, April 28, 1559, made Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer, revised, the law of English liturgy, and forbade all other religious ritual. The Mass was abolished. All Englishmen were required to attend the Sunday service of the Anglican Church, or forfeit a shilling for the succor of the poor. A new Act of Supremacy, April 29th, declared Elizabeth to be the supreme governor of England in all matters, spiritual or temporal. An oath of supremacy acknowledging the religious sovereignty of the Queen was required of all clergymen, lawyers, teachers, university graduates, and magistrates, and all employees of the Church or the Crown. All major ecclesiastical appointments and decisions were to be made by an ecclesiastical court of high commission chosen by the government. Any defense of papal authority over England was to be punished by life imprisonment for the first offense, by death for the second, 1563. By 1590, all English churches were Protestant. Elizabeth pretended that she was not persecuting opinion. Any man, she said, might think and believe as he pleased, provided he obeyed the laws. All she asked was external conformity for the sake of national unity. Cecil assured her that that state could never be in safety where there was toleration of two religions, which did not deter Elizabeth from demanding toleration of French Protestants in Catholic France. She had no objection to peaceful hypocrisy, but freedom of opinion was not to be freedom of speech. Preachers who disagreed with her views on any important subject were silenced or dismissed. The laws against heresy were redefined and enforced. Unitarians and Anabaptists were outlawed. 5 heretics were burned during the reign, which seemed a modest number in its day. In 1563, a convocation of theologians defined the new creed. All were agreed on predestination. God, of his own free will, before the creation of the world, and without regard to individual human merit or demerit, had chosen some of mankind to be elect and saved, leaving all the rest to be reprobate and damned. They accepted Lutheran justification, salvation, by faith. That is, the elect were saved not by their good works, but by belief in the grace of God and the redeeming blood of Christ. However, they interpreted the Eucharist in Calvin's sense as a spiritual rather than a physical communion with Christ. By an Act of Parliament, 1566, the 39 articles embodying the new theology were made obligatory on all the clergy of England, and they still express the official Anglican creed. The new ritual, too, was a compromise. The Mass was abolished, but to the horror of the Puritans, the clergy were instructed to wear white surplices in reading the service and copes in administering the Eucharist. Communion was to be received kneeling, in the 2 forms of bread and wine. The invocation of saints was replaced by annual commemoration of Protestant heroes. Confirmation and ordination were retained as sacred rites, but were not viewed as sacraments instituted by Christ, and confession to a priest was encouraged only in expectation of death. Many of the prayers kept Roman Catholic forms, but took on English dress and became a noble and formative part of the nation's literature. For 400 years these prayers and hymns, recited by congregation and priest in the spacious splendor of cathedrals or the simple dignity of the parish church, have given English families inspiration, consolation, moral discipline, and mental peace. 6. Elizabeth and the Catholics. It was now the turn of the Catholics to suffer persecution. Though still in the majority, they were forbidden to hold Catholic services or possess Catholic literature. Religious images in the churches were destroyed by government order, and altars were removed. 6 Oxford students were sent to the Tower for resisting the removal of a crucifix from their college chapel. Most Catholics submitted sadly to the new regulations, but a considerable number preferred to pay the fines for non-attendance at the Anglican ritual. The Royal Council calculated some 50,000 such recusants in England, 1580. Anglican bishops complained to the government that Mass was being said in private homes, that Catholicism was emerging into public worship, and that in some ardent localities it was unsafe to be a Protestant. Elizabeth rebuked Archbishop Parker for laxity, 1565, and thereafter the laws were more rigorously enforced. Catholics who had heard Mass in the chapel of the Spanish ambassador were imprisoned. Houses in London were searched. Strangers found there were ordered to give an account of their religion. Magistrates were commanded to punish all persons possessing books of Roman Catholic theology, 1567. We must not judge this legislation in terms of the relative religious toleration earned for us by the philosophers and revolutions of the 17th and 18th centuries. The faiths were then at war and were entangled with politics, a field in which toleration has always been limited. All parties and governments in the 16th century agreed that theological dissent was a form of political revolt. The religious conflict became explicitly political when Pope Pius V, after what he felt had been a long and patient delay, issued a bull, 1570, that not only excommunicated Elizabeth but absolved her subjects from allegiance to her, and forbade them to obey her monitions, mandates, and laws. The bull was suppressed in France and Spain, which were then seeking friendship with England, but a copy of it was clandestinely posted on the door of the episcopal residence in London. The culprit was discovered and put to death. Faced by this declaration of war, the Queen's ministers asked Parliament for stricter anti-Catholic laws. Statutes were passed making it a capital crime to call the Queen a heretic, schismatic, usurper, or tyrant, or to introduce a papal bull into England, or to convert a Protestant to the Roman Church. The Court of High Commission was authorized to examine the opinions of any suspected person and to punish any of his unpunished offenses against any law, including fornication or adultery. The Catholic monarchs of Europe could not with much face protest against these oppressive measures, which so resembled their own. Most English Catholics continued to submit peaceably, and Elizabeth's government hoped that habit would generate acceptance and, in time, belief. It was to prevent this that William Allen, an émigré Englishman, founded at Douay, then in the Spanish Netherlands, a college and seminary to train English Catholics for missionary service in England. He expounded his purpose fervently. "We make it our first and foremost study to stir up in the minds of Catholics zeal and just indignation against the heretics. This we do by setting before the eyes of the students the exceeding majesty of the ceremonial of the Catholic Church in the place where we live. At the same time, we recall the mournful contrast that obtains at home, the utter desolation of all things sacred which there exists. Our friends and kinsfolk, all our dear ones, and countless souls besides, perishing in schism and godlessness. Every jail and dungeon filled to overflowing, not with thieves and villains, but with Christ's priests and servants, nay, with our parents and kinsmen. There is nothing, then, that we ought not to suffer, rather than to look on at the ills that affect our nation." The college functioned at Douay till 1578, when the Calvinists captured the town, then at Reims, then again at Douay, 1593. The Douay Bible, an English translation of the Latin Vulgate, was produced at Reims and Douay, 1582 to 1610, and reached publication a year before the King James Version. Between 1574 and 1585, the college ordained 275 graduates and sent 268 to labor in England. Allen was called to Rome and made a cardinal, but the work went on. 170 additional priests were dispatched to England before Elizabeth's death in 1603. Of the 438 total, 98 suffered the capital penalty. The leadership of the missionaries passed to a Jesuit, Robert Parsons, a man of enthusiasm and courage, a firebrand of polemics, and a master of English prose. He frankly announced that the bull deposing Elizabeth justified her assassination. Many English Catholics were shocked, but Tolomeo Gali, Secretary of State to Pope Gregory XIII, gave the idea his approval. Parsons urged the Catholic powers to invade England. The Spanish ambassador in England condemned the plan as criminal folly, and Everard Mercurian, general of the Jesuit order, forbade Parsons to meddle in politics. Undeterred, he decided on a personal invasion. He disguised himself as an English officer returning from service in the Netherlands. His martial swagger, gold lace coat, and feathered hat carried him through the frontier officials, 1580. He even smoothed the way for another Jesuit, Edmund Campion, to follow him in the guise of a jewel merchant. They were secretly housed in the heart of London. They visited imprisoned Catholics and found them leniently treated. Recruiting lay and sacerdotal aides, they began their work of inspiring Catholics to remain faithful to the Church and reconverting recent apostates to the Protestant creed. Secular priests hiding in England, alarmed at the boldness of the missionaries, warned them that they would soon be caught and arrested, and that their detection would make matters worse for the Catholics, and they begged them to return to the continent. But Parsons and Campion persisted. They moved from town to town, holding secret assemblies, hearing confessions, saying Mass, and giving their benediction to the whispering worshippers who looked upon them as messengers from God. Within a year of their coming they made, it was claimed, 20,000 converts. They set up a printing press and scattered propaganda. Tracts declaring that Elizabeth, having been excommunicated, was no longer the lawful Queen of England, were found in London streets. A third Jesuit was sent to Edinburgh to urge the Scottish Catholics to invade England from the north. The Earl of Westmoreland answered a summons from the Vatican. He brought back from Rome to Flanders a mass of bullion to finance an invasion from the Netherlands. By the summer of 1581, many Catholics believed, the Spanish troops of Alva would cross into England. Warned by its spies, the English government doubled its efforts to capture the Jesuits. Parsons found his way across the Channel, but Campion was caught, July 1581. He was carried through sympathetic villages and hostile London to the Tower. Elizabeth sent for him and tried to save him. She asked, did he consider her his lawful sovereign? He replied that he did. But to her next question, could the Pope lawfully excommunicate her, he answered that he could not decide an issue on which learned men were divided. She sent him back to the Tower, with instructions that he be kindly treated, but Cecil ordered him to be tortured into naming his fellow conspirators. After 2 days of agony, he yielded a few names, and more arrests were made. Recovering his audacity, Campion challenged Protestant divines to a public debate. By permission of the council, a debate was staged in the chapel of the Tower. Courtiers, prisoners, and public were admitted, and the Jesuits stood for hours on weakened legs to plead for the Catholic theology. Neither side convinced the other, but when Campion was brought to trial, the charge was not heresy, but conspiracy to overthrow the government by internal subversion and external attack. He and 14 others were convicted, and on December 1st, 1581, they were hanged. Those Catholics proved right who had predicted that the Jesuit mission would exasperate the government into further persecution. Elizabeth issued an appeal to her subjects to judge between her and those who sought her throne or her life. Parliament decreed, 1581, that conversion to Catholicism should be punished as high treason, that any priest who said Mass should be fined 200 marks and be imprisoned for a year, and that those who refused to attend Anglican services should pay £20 a month, enough to bankrupt any but the richest Catholics. Failure to pay the fine incurred arrest and confiscation of property. Soon the prisons were so crowded with Catholics that old castles had to be used as jails. Tension rose on all sides, heightened by the imminent execution of Mary Stuart and the intensified conflict with Spain and Rome. In June 1583, a papal nuncio offered Gregory XIII a detailed plan for the invasion of England by 3 armies at once from Ireland, France, and Spain. The Pope gave sympathetic consideration to this disegno per l'impresa d'Inghilterra, and specific measures were prepared, but English spies got wind of them, England made counter-preparations, and the invasion was postponed. Parliament retaliated with more repressive legislation. All priests ordained since June 1559 and still refusing the oath of supremacy were required to leave the country within 40 days or suffer death as treasonous conspirators, and all who harbored them were to be hanged. On the basis of this and other laws, 123 priests and 60 laymen were executed during the reign of Elizabeth, and probably another 200 died in jail. Some Protestants protested against the severity of this legislation. Some were converted to Catholicism. Cecil's grandson William fled to Rome, 1585, and pledged obedience to the Pope. Most English Catholics were opposed to any violent action against the government. One faction among them addressed an appeal to Elizabeth, 1585, affirmed their loyalty, and asked for a merciful consideration of their sufferings. But, as if to bear out the government's claim that its measures were justified by war, Cardinal Allen issued, 1588, a tract designed to rouse the English Catholics to support the approaching attack on England by Spain. He called the Queen an incestuous bastard, begotten and born in sin of an infamous courtesan, charged that, with Leicester and divers others, she hath abused her body by unspeakable and incredible variety of lust, demanded that the Catholics of England should rise against this depraved, accursed, excommunicate heretic, and promised a plenary indulgence to all who should aid in deposing the chief spectacle of sin and abomination in this age. The Catholics of England answered by fighting as bravely as the Protestants against the Spanish Armada. After that victory, the persecution continued as part of the continuing war. 61 priests and 49 laymen were hanged between 1588 and 1603, and many of these were cut down from the gibbet and were drawn and quartered. That is, they were disemboweled and torn limb from trunk while still alive. In a remarkable address presented to the Queen in the year of her death, 13 priests petitioned her to be allowed to remain in England. They repudiated all attacks on her right to the throne, and denied the authority of the Pope to depose her, but could not in conscience acknowledge anyone but the Pope as head of the Christian Church. The document reached the Queen only a few days before her death, and no result of it is recorded, but unwittingly it outlined the principles on which, 2 centuries later, the problem would be solved. The Queen died a victor in the greatest struggle of a reign stained with no darker blot than this victory. 7. Elizabeth and the Puritans. Against an apparently weaker enemy, a handful of Puritans, she did not prevail. They were men who had felt the influence of Calvin. Some of them had visited Calvin's Geneva as Marian refugees. Many of them had read the Bible in a translation made and annotated by Genevan Calvinists. Some had heard or read the blasts of John Knox's trumpet. Some may have heard echoes of Wycliffe's Lollard Poor Priests. Taking the Bible as their infallible guide, they found nothing in it about the episcopal powers and sacerdotal vestments that Elizabeth had transferred from the Roman to the Anglican Church. On the contrary, they found much about presbyters having no sovereign but Christ. They acknowledged Elizabeth as head of the Church in England, but only to bar the Pope. In their hearts they rejected any control of religion by the state, and aspired to control of the state by their religion. Toward 1564 they began to be called Puritans, as a term of abuse, because they demanded the purification of English Protestantism from all forms of faith and worship not found in the New Testament. They took the doctrines of predestination, election, and damnation deeply to heart, and felt that hell could be escaped only by subordinating every aspect of life to religion and morality. As they read the Bible in the solemn Sundays of their homes, the figure of Christ almost disappeared against the background of the Old Testament's jealous and vengeful Jehovah. The Puritan attack on Elizabeth took form, 1569, when the lectures of Thomas Cartwright, professor of theology at Cambridge, stressed the contrast between the Presbyterian organization of the early Christian Church and the Episcopalian structure of the Anglican establishment. Many of the faculty supported Cartwright, but John Whitgift, headmaster of Trinity College, denounced him to the Queen and secured his dismissal from the teaching staff, 1570. Cartwright emigrated to Geneva, where, under Théodore de Bèze, he imbibed the full ardor of Calvinist theocracy. Returning to England, he shared with Walter Travers and others in formulating the Puritan conception of the Church. Christ, in their view, had arranged that all ecclesiastical authority should be vested in ministers and lay elders elected by each parish, province, and state. The consistories, so formed, should determine creed, ritual, and moral code in conformity with Scripture. They should have access to every home, power to enforce at least outward observance of godly living, and the right to excommunicate recalcitrants and condemn heretics to death. The civil magistrates were to carry out these disciplinary decrees, but the state was to have no spiritual jurisdiction whatever. The first English parish organized on these principles was set up at Wandsworth in 1572, and similar presbyteries sprang up in the eastern and middle counties. By this time the majority of the London Protestants and of the House of Commons were Puritans. The artisans of London, powerfully infiltrated by Calvinist refugees from France and the Netherlands, applauded the Puritan attack on episcopacy and ritual. The businessmen of the capital looked upon Puritanism as the bulwark of Protestantism against a Catholicism traditionally unsympathetic to usury and the middle classes. Calvin was a bit too strict for them, but he had sanctioned interest and had recognized the virtues of industry and thrift. Even men close to the Queen had found some good in Puritanism. Cecil, Leicester, Walsingham, and Knowles hoped to use it as a foil to Catholicism if Mary Stuart reached the English throne. But Elizabeth felt that the Puritan movement threatened the whole settlement by which she had planned to ease the religious strife. She thought of Calvinism as the doctrine of John Knox, whom she had never forgiven for his scorn of women rulers. She despised the Puritan dogmatism even more heartily than the Catholic. She had a lingering fondness for the crucifix and other religious images, and when an iconoclastic fury destroyed paintings, statuary, and stained glass early in her reign, she awarded damages to the victims and forbade such actions in the future. She was not finicky in her own language, but she resented the description which some Puritan had given of the prayer book as culled and picked out of that popish dunghill, the Mass book, and of the Court of High Commission as a little stinking ditch. She saw in the popular election of ministers and in the government of the Church by presbyteries and synods independent of the state a republican threat to monarchy. Only her monarchical power, she thought, could keep England Protestant. Popular suffrage would restore Catholicism. She encouraged bishops to trouble the troublemakers. Archbishop Parker suppressed their publications, silenced them in the churches, and obstructed their assemblies. Puritan clergymen had organized groups for the public discussion of scriptural passages. Elizabeth bade Parker put an end to these prophesyings, which he did. His successor, Edmund Grindal, tried to protect the Puritans. Elizabeth suspended him, and when he died, 1583, she advanced to the Canterbury See her new chaplain, John Whitgift, who dedicated himself to the silencing of the Puritans. He demanded of all English clergy an oath accepting the 39 Articles, the Prayer Book, and the Queen's religious supremacy. He subpoenaed all objectors before the High Commission Court, and there they were subjected to such detailed and insistent inquiry into their conduct and belief that Cecil compared the procedure to the Spanish Inquisition. The Puritan rebellion was intensified. A determined minority openly seceded from the Anglican Communion and set up independent congregations that elected their own ministers and acknowledged no episcopal control. In 1581, Robert Brown, a pupil, later an enemy of Cartwright, and chief voice of these independents, separatists, or Congregationalists, crossed over to Holland, and he published there 2 tracts outlining a democratic constitution for Christianity. Any group of Christians should have the right to organize itself for worship, formulate its own creed on the basis of Scripture, choose its own leaders, and live its religious life free from outside interference, acknowledging no rule but the Bible, no authority but Christ. 2 of Brown's followers were arrested in England, were judged in contempt of the Queen's religious sovereignty, and were hanged, 1583. In the campaign for election to the Parliament of 1586, the Puritans waged oratorical war upon any candidate unsympathetic to their cause. One such was branded as a common gamester and pot companion. Another was much suspect of popery, cometh very seldom to his church, and is a whoremaster. Those were days of virile speech. When Parliament convened, John Penry presented a petition for reform of the Church, and charged the bishops with responsibility for clerical abuses and popular paganism. Whitgift ordered his arrest, but he was soon released. Anthony Cope introduced a bill to abolish the entire episcopal establishment and reorganize English Christianity on the Presbyterian plan. Elizabeth ordered Parliament to remove the bill from discussion. Peter Wentworth rose to a question of parliamentary freedom, and 4 members supported him. Elizabeth had all 5 lodged in the Tower. Frustrated in Parliament, Penry and other Puritans took to the press. Eluding Whitgift's severe censorship of publications, they deluged England, 1588 to 89, with a succession of privately printed pamphlets, all signed Martin Marprelate, gentleman, and attacking the authority and personal character of the bishops in terms of satirical abuse. Whitgift and the High Commission deployed all the machinery of espionage to find the authors and printers, but the printers moved from town to town, and public sympathy helped them to escape detection until April 1589. Professional writers like John Lilly and Thomas Nash were engaged to answer Martin, and gave him good competition in scurrility. Finally, as Billingsgate ran out, the controversy subsided, and moderate men mourned the degradation of Christianity into an art of vituperation. Stung by these pamphlets, Elizabeth gave Whitgift a free hand to check the Puritans. The Marprelate printers were found, arrests multiplied, executions followed. Cartwright was sentenced to death but was pardoned by the Queen. Two leaders of the Brownian movement, John Greenwood and Henry Barrow, were hanged in 1593, and soon thereafter John Penry. Parliament decreed, 1593, that anyone who questioned the Queen's religious supremacy or persistently absented himself from Anglican services, or attended any assemblies, conventicles, or meetings under cover or pretense of any exercise of religion, should be imprisoned and, unless he gave a pledge of future conformity, should leave England and never return on pain of death. At this juncture, and amid the turmoil and fury, a modest parson raised the controversy to the level of philosophy, piety, and stately prose. Richard Hooker was one of two clergymen assigned to conduct services in the London Temple. The other was Walter Travers, Cartwright's friend. In the morning sermon, Hooker expounded the ecclesiastical polity of Elizabeth. In the afternoon, Travers criticized that church government from the Puritan view. Each developed his sermons into a book. As Hooker was writing literature as well as theology, he begged his bishop to transfer him to a quiet rural parsonage. So at Boscombe in Wiltshire, he completed the first 4 books of his great work of the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, 1594. 3 years later, at Bishopsbourne, he sent Book 5 to the press, and there, in 1600, age 47, he died. His Laws astonished England by the calm and even-tempered dignity of its argument, and the sonorous majesty of its almost Latin style. Cardinal Allen praised it as the best book that had yet come out of England. Pope Clement VIII lauded its eloquence and learning. Queen Elizabeth read it gratefully as a splendid apology for her religious government. The Puritans were mollified by the gentle clarity of its tone, and posterity received it as a noble attempt to harmonize religion and reason. Hooker astonished his contemporaries by admitting that even a pope could be saved. He shocked the theologians by declaring that the assurance of what we believe by the word of God is to us not so certain as that which we perceive by sense. Man's reasoning faculty is also a divine gift and revelation. Hooker based his theory of law on medieval philosophy as formulated by St. Thomas Aquinas, and he anticipated the social contract of Hobbes and Locke. After showing the need and boon of social organization, he argued that voluntary participation in a society implies consent to be governed by its laws. But the ultimate source of the laws is the community itself. A king or a parliament may issue laws only as the delegate or representatives of the community. Law makes the king. The king's grant of any favor contrary to the law is void. For peaceable contentment on both sides, the assent of those who are governed seemeth necessary. Laws are not which public approbation has not made so. And Hooker added a passage that might have warned Charles I. The Parliament of England, together with the ecclesiastical convocation annexed thereunto, is that whereupon the very essence of all government within this kingdom doth depend. It is even the body of the whole realm. It consisteth of the king and of all that within the land are subject to him, for they are all there present, either in person or by such as they voluntarily have derived, delegated, their power unto. To Hooker, religion seemed an integral part of the state, for social order and therefore even material prosperity depend on moral discipline, which collapses without religious inculcation and support. Consequently, every state should provide religious training for its people. The Anglican Church might be imperfect, but so would be all institutions made and manned by the children of Adam. He that goeth about to persuade a multitude that they are not so well off as they ought to be, shall never want attentive and favorable hearers, because they know the manifold defects whereunto every kind of regiment, government, is subject, but the secret lets and difficulties, which in public proceedings are innumerable and inevitable, they have not ordinarily the judgment to consider. Hooker's logic was too circular to be convincing, his learning too scholastic to meet the issues of his time, his shy spirit too thankful for order to understand the longing for liberty. The Puritans acknowledged his eloquence, but went on their way. Compelled to choose between their country and their faith, many of them emigrated, reversing the movement of continental Protestants into England. Holland welcomed them, and English congregations rose at Middelburg, Leyden, and Amsterdam. There the exiles and their offspring labored, taught, preached, and wrote, preparing with quiet passion for their triumphs in England and their fulfillment in America. 8. Elizabeth and Ireland. Ireland had been conquered by the English in 1169–71, and had been held ever since on the ground that otherwise it would be used by France or Spain as a base for attacks on England. At Elizabeth's accession, direct English rule in Ireland was confined to the eastern coast, the Pale, around and south of Dublin. The rest of the island was governed by Irish chieftains, only nominally acknowledging English sovereignty. The perennial conflict with the English disrupted the tribal administration that had given Ireland chaos and violence, but also poets, scholars, and saints. Most of the land was left to woods and bogs. Transport and communication were heroic enterprises, and the native Celtic population of some 800,000 souls lived in a half-lawless misery on the edge of barbarism. The English in the Pale were almost as poor, and they made Elizabeth's problem worse by debauchery, peculation, and crime. They robbed the London government